One of the major tools that mainstream historians use to create modern chronology is the dating of Egypt. Right now, mainstream historians honestly believe that they have pretty much all of ancient Egypt mapped out and dated all the way back until like 5,000 years ago. And of course, the general establishment backs up their chronology. So what has happened is that because Egypt is a kind of crucial part of the world that was connected to other civilizations, when you go to date a surrounding civilization, if you can find some kind of a connection to Egypt, then in theory, you can use Egyptian chronology to date that civilization or date some aspect of that civilization. Now, this sounds fantastic on paper. This sounds amazing, right? You're just like, wow, yes, of course, that makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? If we know all of the dates of Egypt, then of course we should be able to cross-reference other artifacts or civilizations, etc., against the Egyptian chronology, and then we should be able to get a date for that specific situation. There is a problem with this, though. The current Egyptian chronology is based on some of the worst historical work that you can imagine. Now, if you just thought, but hold on a second, don't we have all of these hieroglyphics? Wouldn't that tell us everything we know about Egypt? I mean, we have writing. There's a problem with that as well. So the first part is that we do not have entire libraries of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. That does not exist. All we have is hieroglyphics on ruins. So right there, you are already going to be limited on what you could ever know about ancient Egypt. That's just a fact. There's no way around that. I mean, think about it. Right now, mainstream historians say that ancient Egypt has like 5,000 years. Okay, 5,000 years is a lot of time. A lot of people do not realize how long 5,000 years truly is. Even just 100 years is a long time. For example, let's take a younger country. Let's take America. America is over 200 years old, okay? Do you believe that you could fit the vast majority of American history on some buildings? No, you can't do that. It's not going to happen. Do you honestly believe that right now, if you were to look at American buildings, you would be able to get out an entire history of just a couple of hundred years? No. You would never get a clear picture of American history simply by looking at the scribblings on some of our buildings. Now, with America, we have an entire country full of buildings. I mean, it's huge, right? We have an entire continent, essentially. So there's a lot of buildings, too. With Egypt, you do not have that. You have a small little part in North Africa, and you have a few megalithic structures that retained any of these hieroglyphics. So there's no way at all in any world on this planet that you could ever hope to get any kind of real detailed information to the extent that the Egyptologists claim they have from hieroglyphics. Now, of course, it gets even worse if you start thinking, well, I mean, don't they have all this papyrus? Don't they have tons of scrolls just hanging around? And of course the answer is no! There are not 5,000-year-old papyri just laying around. They did not find some huge treasure trove of papyri from 4,000 to 5,000 years ago that went through and documented all of ancient Egyptian history. That does not exist. There's nothing like that. Egyptologists do not have that level of information to make any of the claims that they currently make. And they certainly do not have enough information to start giving us real dates. Remember, the Egyptians did not use the same dating system that we use today. Their calendars were completely different, actually, the further you go back. The calendars, in some cases, are not 365 days. There's a time period where it's 360 days. And you go back further and the calendars change again. So we have an immediate problem. We have to ask ourselves, how are Egyptologists coming to all of these conclusions that they are coming to? How are they creating a chronology that the entire world seems to trust? Because the reality is they do not possess the kinds of evidence that would be and is required to create the chronology that they claim to have. So we have a serious problem. When we look at it further and we start seeing that other historians will use ancient Egyptian chronology to go ahead and calibrate and or compare against, other artifacts and other civilizations, what that means is that when those historians are dating other objects or whatever off of Egyptian chronology, and if Egyptian chronology is wrong, then what's going to happen to those historians' dates? What's going to happen? I mean, if Egyptian chronology is factually based on garbage, and other historians are using it as a foundation for dating other aspects of history, where does that put us? Yeah, it screws us. We're screwed. Like, it totally destroys everything. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in right now with respect to history. The only reason why nobody realizes that this is happening is because everybody trusts the mainstream institutions. Which is ironic because otherwise alternative historians, they don't really trust the Egyptologists, generally speaking, right? You have all kinds of alternative historians who will happily say that Atlanteans built the pyramids or aliens built the pyramids or whatever. But when it comes to the actual ancient Egyptian chronology, oh no, that's all correct. All the pharaohs are correct. All those dates are 100% accurate. It's insane. It's absolutely mind-boggling. The level of cognitive dissonance that the current alternative historical community has is absolutely hilarious. And it would be really funny if it wasn't so sad. Because right now, the alternative historical community bases a lot of their possible research off of false garbage chronology created by the same mainstream that they generally despise anyways. Right? People are holding two completely different opinions in their head simultaneously, and they're operating off of that. Like, how can you ever hope to discover the truth about history if that is how you are going to operate? You can't do it. Like, it's just not possible. Anyway, so what I want to go over today is you don't have to listen to me about the chronological problems, okay? Everything I just said is 100% accurate, but let me give you guys another perspective on the Egyptian chronology and what's wrong with it. So I want to read a little snippet from AT Fomenko's chronology book, and he goes over a little bit of this about some of the problems with ancient Egyptian chronology, why it's a problem, and of course why you shouldn't pay attention to it, because you shouldn't. I mean, ancient Egyptian chronology in the mainstream is insane. And the fact that we have people all over this planet basing a lot of aspects of their history on this false chronology, it's created an entire chaotic mess of garbage, right? Like, nothing we believe in nowadays, in the mainstream anyways, is true. And that's like a scientific fact. Okay, let's do this. This section is entitled
The Problems in Establishing a Correct Chronology of Ancient Egypt.
The significant discrepancies between the chronological data offered by the ancient sources and the global chronology of the ancient times as devised in the 17th century arose in other areas as well. For instance, the establishment of the Egyptian chronology presented some substantial difficulties, since a great many documents contain chronological contradictions. Let us examine the correlation between the classical history by Herodotus and the Scaligerrian chronology. For instance, during his consecutive and coherent account of Egyptian history, Herodotus calls Cheops the successor of Rhampsinitos. The modern commentator will immediately correct in the following manner. Herodotus creates confusion in the chronology of Egypt. Rhampsinitos, or Ramses II, was a king of the 19th dynasty, which would be between 1345 to 1200 BC, whilst Cheops belonged to the 4th, which would be 2600 to 2480 BC. The discrepancy here equals 1200 years, no less. Just think of what the figure implies and of its sheer value. 1200 years! Let us carry on. According to Herodotus, Esekis was succeeded by Anisis. And yes, I realize that I am probably butchering these names. Just deal with it. Modern commentary is also rash to tell us that Herodotus leaps from the end of the 4th dynasty, about 2480 BC, to the beginning of the Ethiopian reign in Egypt, about 715 BC. That leap is one of 1800 years. 1800 years. Now, this number is interesting because, as we now know, this 1800 years date, that this time frame, shows up all over the place. One of the main areas that it ends up showing up is with respect to ancient Greek chronology. What has been discovered relatively recently is that there is quite literally no such thing as ancient Greece as we know it, or as it's portrayed in modern times. Something happened with the chronology to where chronologists during the Middle Ages decided they needed to add upwards of 1800 years to Greek chronology to make all the other chronologies work. And of course, Egyptian chronology would have been affected as well. So it's interesting to see Fomenko coming to these numbers as well. Let's go on. In general, it turns out that the chronology of kings given by Herodotus does not concur with that found in the fragments of Manetho's list of kings. Now, the kings list is messed up. Like, that whole situation is beyond trash. Because the problem with the kings list is that there is no real chronology to the kings list. We also have to remember that multiple kings lists have been discovered, and a lot of the kings lists that were discovered are either partials, duplicates, or potentially fraudulent. But that did not stop the Egyptologists from grabbing all of these kings lists, these supposed kings lists, because don't remember, these quote-unquote kings lists, that we have no reason to believe that any of these people were kings. Like, there's absolutely zero reason to believe that. This is a supposition by mainstream Egyptologists. They just believe that it is some sort of a magical kings list. To make it even funnier, you know what they had to do with the kings list? Because there's no dates on these kings lists. Like, yeah, you would think there'd be dates, right? So if an Egyptologist is going to talk, so confidently about all of these dates, you would think that there would be some kind of date that they've deciphered. There are no dates on any of these lists. The kings list itself is literally just a list of random names. Egyptologists have decided they're all kings. Now, it's entirely possible that, yeah, some of these are kings, no doubt. But here's the other problem. It's also possible that a lot of the people on the kings lists they could be dignitaries, politicians, lords. They could hold all kinds of other stations. And to make it even funnier, because there's no dates on these kings lists, the quote unquote kings list, it's also entirely possible that a lot of these people existed simultaneously with one another. So when we look at the kings list is like drawn out for thousands of years. And the reason why is because there are so many names that Egyptologists had to account for. And they think it's in some kind of a sequence. They don't take into account the possibility that there could have been names on that list that existed simultaneously. It gets even crazier because the way they ended up allocating time periods to the kings list, and I don't know if Fomenko's going to talk about this, so my bad if he repeats it, but I'm going to spoil it anyways if he does. They literally took these names, and to give ruling periods of time to these names, what they did is they just cut centuries into thirds. So basically, every single name that's accepted on that king's list as being in the Egyptian chronology is essentially said to rule 33 and a third years. Yeah, that's what they did. Basically, every single name on that list just rules for 33 and a third years because they don't have any way of really knowing how long, even if they were all kings. Even if the king's list was a legitimate list of kings, they have no clue how long all of these kings actually reigned. So they just cut it into thirds and averaged it out. Yeah, how do you like that? That's Egyptology. That is literally what mainstream Egyptology teaches as fact. That's insane. Okay, let's go. As a rule, the chronology of Herodotus is much shorter than Scaliger's version. The temporal distances between the kings, according to Herodotus, are often thousands of years shorter than the corresponding periods as given by Manetho. The history of Herodotus contains a great number of quote-unquote minor errors, those of 30 to 40 years. However, they only come to existence as a result of attempts at fitting his history into the Scaligerian chronology. It's amazing how many things just absolutely destroy the Scaligerian chronology. You know, it's funny, I know there's a whole conflict around Herodotus. I realize that there is a school of thought that Herodotus is completely just absolutely forged and, it's fraudulent, I guess you could say. I understand that. And there might be a little truth to that. I don't know. But if you look at Herodotus through a different light, if you look at Herodotus through the light of real chronology, things suddenly change, and suddenly Herodotus's stories start to line up more accurately with reality. So what I mean by that is, instead of throwing Herodotus backwards into the 5th century BC, we instead move him up into, say, the Middle Ages. Suddenly all of his writings start to make more sense. And in fact, now that I think about it, if Herodotus... Okay, so check this out. So if that 1800-year gap is removed from Greek chronology, where does that put Herodotus? Well, that would move Herodotus up around 700 AD time frame. So now he's a lot closer to us, which means a lot of the stuff that he's talking about will now make more sense in the context of real chronology. It gets even more interesting when you do more chronology against Herodotus and you start to realize that he probably didn't live in 700 AD, 1300 years ago. He probably was living around 1200-ish AD. Now, that's a whole other show, and we'll talk about that later. But that's just something to keep in mind when we start to think about Herodotus, and maybe you think he's fraudulent or that he's wrong. When you put him in the correct chronological context, a lot of his writings start to make infinitely more sense. It also starts to make the geography of the areas start to make more sense relative to the catastrophes that took place just before he would have been around. So Herodotus probably was writing his histories, only a few centuries after the Zero event, for example. That would probably be where he truly actually lived. That would have been enough time for people to have essentially forgotten a lot of the major points just due to all of the destruction, but it would still be sort of relatively fresh enough on people's minds to where he would have been able to record some of the more crazier stories that some of the people recount. Right? And he just recounts the stories. He doesn't, well, he supposedly just recounts the stories and doesn't make anything up. He just records them as they're told to him. But those stories all start to make a lot more sense in that context. And it also completely changes the perspective when you start to look at Scaligerian history. One of the major crimes that is being committed nowadays in historical research by the alternative community is that none of those guys are generally paying attention to chronology. It's ironic that the alternative historians still believe mainstream chronology, even though they completely don't believe a lot of the stuff that, actually happened. It's a weird contradiction in the alternative community. It's like the Ice Age. It's like all these people are desperately looking for an answer for all the evidence of cataclysms that they see, but they don't want to break out of mainstream science. It's like they're almost there, but because of everybody's programming, because of everybody is so used to ingesting the mainstream science, they don't want to realize that it's all garbage, right? Even though the evidence is right in front of them. So it's funny, now it's kind of a game nowadays to me, just watching all of these alternative researchers just kind of bumping into each other, trying to desperately fit in their theory with the mainstream science because they believe the mainstream science is real. It's the same thing with mainstream history. Mainstream history is false on a level that is absolutely hilarious, and the scientific evidence is right there. But alternative researchers, they don't want to acknowledge that, so they'll attack Herodotus, but they don't stop and question, oh wait, maybe Herodotus lived in a completely different time period. Maybe the reason why a lot of the stuff that Herodotus talks about doesn't line up with Scaligerian chronology is because Scaligerian chronology is garbage. And it is. I mean, Joseph Scaliger and Petavius, those two guys are they did an absolute great job of destroying and corrupting history. And then, of course, it's not just them. There was countless people doing the same damn thing during the exact same time they were doing it, right? There's a whole, okay, yeah, all right, let's move on. As a rule, the chronology of Herodotus is much shorter than the Scaligerian version. The temporal distances between kings, according to Herodotus, are often thousands of years shorter than corresponding periods as given by Manetho. The history of Herodotus contains a great number of minor errors, those of 30 to 40 years. However, they only come to existence as a result of attempts to fitting his history into the Scaligerian chronology. We quote some of the numerous examples of such occurrences. The modern commentator tells us that, quote, Herodotus confuses King Sesostris with the king of Psammetichs I. Also, Picatus could not have met Croesus in 560 BC. By the way, Herodotus does not give the date in such terms, since he had died in 570 BC. Unquote. Another event related by Herodotus is commented upon thusly, quote, It is an error made by Herodotus. Solon could not have met Croesus. Unquote. But how can this be true? Herodotus devotes an entire page to relating the interactions between Croesus and Solon. The Scaligerian chronology, on the other hand, tells us no such interactions ever took place. Now, the Solon part is interesting because, of course, Solon is related to Plato. Because, of course, Solon is who gives Plato the story of Atlantis. So if we factor in that 1800-year gap and we get rid of the 1800 years, what happens? Well, suddenly Solon now exists in the early Middle Ages. This would also mean that Plato would have lived in the early Middle Ages as well. Now, do we have proof of that? Yes, we do. What happens in the early Middle Ages? Well, there is a supposed Platonic revival, and the guy who does this is named Pletho. Pletho starts to spread Plato all around the place, once again, supposedly, according to mainstream history. What if we get rid of the concept of Pletho reviving Plato, and we just say that Pletho is Plato? Is it possible that Pletho was writing under the pseudonym of Plato so that he would not be executed for all of the stuff that he was writing? We actually have a lot of evidence that is now proving that to be the case. So now suddenly all of these people are living simultaneously with one another, much closer to our period of time. This also starts to explain why they are in the state that they are in with respect to civilization advancement, because these guys are coming out of the zero event period. They live a few centuries later, so that's why they're not operating in high technology. That's why they're still working on things, they're still kind of rediscovering things or trying things out. It's because they're essentially coming out of the last soft reset. This all makes sense when we put it in the context of catastrophism and chronology. You know, it's crazy to see how all of this stuff starts to line up when we simply follow the evidence and apply the scientific method. If we just push aside all of the garbage and just stay objective, everything changes and the picture becomes so much clearer. You know, with respect to Plato, for example, I know what I just said might sound like a crazy claim, but let me ask you this. Do you really believe that we have any reason to believe that Plato existed around 400 BC? Do you honestly believe that's a real thing? What evidence do you have for that? And the reality is, nobody has any evidence for it whatsoever. There is zero, nada, none, no scientific evidence at all that proves that a guy named Plato lived back during that period of time. That is all supposition by the Scaligerine chronologist. That's it. That's it. So if you believe a guy named Plato existed back during that period of ancient Greece, supposed ancient Greece, you literally believe in something with zero evidence. And that's a problem, all right? We can't do that. I know it can kind of be hard to hear because that changes everything, but that's the fact. Like, why, in other aspects of your life, do you believe in things with no evidence? Right? Atheists, they don't believe in God because there's no evidence, and that's fine, I agree. The religious really have not provided any kind of tangible evidence that would convince an atheist, and that, fair enough. But on the other hand, an atheist will have no problem believing in Plato, even though the exact same amount of evidence exists for the existence of Plato as God. So you're kind of in a conundrum in this situation. So this is why it's important to get rid of all the mainstream garbage. And AT Fomenko is talking about this as well. And let's go listen to what he has to say instead of me. All right. The commentators also accuse Herodotus of dating solar eclipses incorrectly, and so on and so forth. Now, the eclipse problem is also interesting, because if Herodotus really did live back in the 5th century BC, obviously he is going to have no clue about eclipses that would have taken place in, say, the early Middle Ages, for example, or a century or two earlier. Like, it wouldn't have made sense. To make it even more interesting, the eclipses that he talks about also would have been recorded during a time of catastrophe, which means that the planetary orbits would have still been askew, to put it in one way. So when the mainstream historical commentators look at Herodotus with respect to his solar eclipses, they don't make any sense because they're trying to place it in a time period that he did not live in. He did not live in the 5th century BC. He lived in the early Middle Ages. So he would have only been talking about eclipses from around then on back, not thousands of years earlier. So that's why the eclipse data makes no sense. And of course, on the other hand, if we have the moon in a slightly different position as well, because the zero event is what changes officially the moon's orbit out of 30 precise days to 29 and change, obviously the equations for the eclipses would change as well. So that's why modern astronomers, when they look at the historical eclipses, they just throw them aside because none of them match up with anything. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is because Herodotus did not live during the time that historians claim. So that's why all of that eclipse data is messed up. Now, when you move Herodotus up towards his real date in the early Middle Ages, suddenly all of that eclipse data becomes infinitely more interesting. And I'm not going to get into it here, but that's like a whole other 10 shows. But that's the situation with the eclipse data from Herodotus. The reality is all evidence, all of it, points in a different direction for how history actually played out. Okay. We should note that the choice of one chronological version among several contradicting ones is far from simple. There had been a conflict between the so-called short and long chronologies of Egypt that were developed in the 19th century. The short chronology is the one currently used, but even it contains a great many deep contradictions which still remain unresolved. The most prominent German Egyptologist, H. Bruch, wrote, quote, "When the reader inquires about whether any epochs and historical moments concerning the pharaohs can be considered to possess a finite chronological assessment, and when his curiosity makes him turn to the tables compiled by a great variety of scientists, he will be surprised to find himself confronted with a large number of opinions on the chronological calculations of the Pharaoh era belonging to the representatives of the newest school. For instance, the German scientists date the reigns of Menes, the first Egyptian pharaoh, as having commenced in the following years. Beck dates this event to 5702 BC, Unger to 5613 BC, Bruch 4455 BC, Loth to 4157 BC, Lepsius to 3892 BC, and Bunsen to 3623 BC. The difference between the two extreme datings is mind-boggling, since it amounts to 2,079 years. The most fundamental research conducted by competent scientists for the verification of the chronological sequence of the pharaohs' reigns and the order of dynastical successions had also proved the necessity for allowing for simultaneous and parallel reigns that would greatly reduce the summary reigning time of the 30 Manetho dynasties. Despite all the scientific discoveries made in this area of Egyptology, the numeric data condition remains in an extremely unsatisfactory condition to this day." Unquote. Holy crap at the run-on sentences. Alright, that's not me. That was like the whole sentence. That dude does not use a period. Crazy, alright. The situation hasn't improved to the present day. Modern tables date the beginning of the reign of Menes differently to approximately 3100 BC, roughly 3000 BC, etc. The fluctuation span for this date amounts to 2,700 years. Do you see what I'm saying? The list is crazy. There is so much phantom time, acknowledged even by the mainstream. What do you even do with that? It is mind-blowing that you can look at articles and entire books written nowadays, and they just, they act as if they have everything laid out. They don't bring up any of these problems, but here they are. I mean, they're right there. You can't get away from them. How can you use Egypt to date anything? Because don't forget, remember, Egypt chronology is used to calibrate other chronologies. If we are finding situations to where the mainstream is willing to admit themselves that 2,700 years is the current unknown time frame of the rules of these pharaohs. 2,700 years? Do you have any idea what can happen in 2,700 years? That's insane. So what has happened then is we have evidence right here, admitted to by the mainstream, that if upwards of 2,700 years have been added to our history, how are you going to look at our current mainstream chronology and have any kind of confidence in it whatsoever? How do you do that? You can't. It's impossible. But nobody brings this up. So what we find is we will find alternative researchers, for example, somebody trying to date the pyramids. Right? They will believe in this mainstream chronology and they won't second guess it. So they will use that mainstream chronology as part of their foundation for whatever theory they're trying to build. Their theory is automatically wrong simply because they did not bother to turn around and look and realize that the mainstream chronology is completely just gone. It doesn't make any sense in any way, shape, or form. What's even funnier is that if you go to these circles and you suggest, showing them that their chronology is just completely wrong. It's not 10,000 years old. It's not 5,000 years old. It's at best maybe 1,000 years old, maybe 1,500 at best. At best. They look at you like you're the crazy one. While they're over there talking about aliens, humming with vibrations and, building weird pyramids. It's just insane. Okay. If we consider other opinions, those of the French Egyptologists, for instance, the situation becomes even more complex. Champollion gives the dating as 5,867 BC. Lesueur gives it as 5,770 BC. Merrier as 5,004 BC. Chabas as 4,000 BC, Mayer as 3,180 BC, Andrzejewski as 2,850 BC, Wilkinson as 2,320 BC, and Palmer as 2,224 BC. The difference between the datings of Champollion and Palmer equals 3,643 years. No commentary is needed, really. And I agree completely. Hey, that's the issue. I mean, Egyptology is so messed up chronologically. You see these huge books that all of these researchers have written, and it begs the question, where the hell are they getting their information from? We have no clue what happened in supposed ancient Egypt. Right? It's absolutely mind-boggling. Right? They don't even acknowledge this stuff. Right? They completely ignore all of this. None of these dates are pushed to the forefront. When was the last time you saw somebody who was trying to explain how the pyramids were built and these kinds of numbers were discussed and the problems that they entail? Never. Nobody does it. And the reason why nobody does it is because it is an inconvenient truth. It's that simple. Right? Modern day people, they want an answer and they want it right now. They want their theory to be the winner, right? They want to be the discoverer. They want all of that. They want the attention, right? They feed off of that. But the reality is nobody can make any claims on any of this stuff because we don't know. We have no idea. There's just nothing there. We discover that generally, quote, Egyptology, which had poured some light over the perpetual darkness that covered the ancient age of Egypt, only came into existence 80 years ago, unquote. as Chantepé de la Tour wrote at the end of the 19th century. He also said that, quote, "It has been the private domain of a very few researchers. Alas, the results of their research have been popularized in too much haste. Thus, many erroneous views entered the circulation, which resulted in the inevitable sobering when Egyptology became a lot less in vogue and the excessive trust in the results of the research was lost. To this day, the construction of the Egyptian chronology remains impossible." Unquote. And that is the truth. Right? We have no way right now, with the evidence that we currently possess, to build a real Egyptian chronology. So if you think some of the stuff I'm talking about is crazy, for example, the Plato situation, bringing Solon more closer to us, Solon the Egyptian who had the story of Atlantis, he's not talking about it back then. He was talking about it relatively close to our time right now. Right? He's not that far away. None of this stuff is that far away. I'm willing to believe that a continent called Atlantis sank. And the only reason why is because the scientific evidence seems to support that. But even more interesting, the scientific evidence seems to support it in the sense that it did not sink 9,000 years ago. It appears that Solon is either misheard, misrecorded, or just wrong because he himself, his people just came out of the zero event catastrophe. He may not have known anymore. Right? That's a whole other discussion as well. I don't want to get into that. Okay, let's keep going. The situation with the list of kings compiled by the Sumerian priests is even more complex. Quote, "It was a historical skeleton of sorts, one that resembled our chronological tables. But, sadly, this list was of little utility. By and large, the chronology of the king's list makes no sense." Unquote, according to the prominent archaeologist L. Woolley. Furthermore, apparently, the dynastical sequences have been set arbitrarily. Like I said, and it has. Like I kind of talked about that earlier on. The way that the dynasties are structured, the supposed dynasties. Remember, we have no proof that these are even dynasties. We have no reason to believe that. They could be companies, right? It could be a CEO and his, vice presidents and stuff in a company. It could literally be something like that. I'm not saying it is that. You see my point, though? We have no clue about the organizational structure that the supposed king's list are actually recording. Like, we have no idea. So it could be anything, right? Okay, anyway. We see that the great antiquity ascribed to these lists today contradicts modern archaeological information. Let us give just one example that we may consider representative enough, telling us about the excavations of what we consider to be the most ancient royal Sumerian sepulchres, dated roughly to the 3rd millennium before Christ. Woolley mentions a series of findings of golden toiletry, which, quote, was of Arabic origin and belonged to the early 13th century AD. According to one of the best experts in the field, unquote. Woolley patronizingly calls the expert's mistake a forgivable one, since no one had thought such advanced art could have existed in the 3rd millennium before Christ. Okay? Unfortunately, the development of the entire critical concept and the propagation of the hypercritical current of the late 19th and early 20th century froze, due to the sheer lack of objective statistic methods at the time. ones that could provide for the independent and objective verification of the previous chronological identifications. And that ends that section. So isn't that insane? So for example, that example that he gives, for example of the example, the example is interesting because they find what is obviously a 13th century artifact in a sepulcher that is supposed to be, dated back to 3000 BC. Well, that's a problem, right? That's an out of place artifact. That is an anachronistic situation. But it's only an anachronistic situation if you believe in the mainstream chronology. If you believe in real chronology, which, by the way, we're still working on. This is not all figured out. Just so nobody believes or thinks that I'm coming from this high place of authority, we are still working on this. Right? This is a work in progress. You could help. Right? You right now, you literally could help us. Everybody. But anyway, if you believe in the mainstream chronology, when findings like this are made, right, they have to be thrown back thousands of years where they never existed. And that is what the mainstream does. And they will say, oh yeah, these artifacts had to have been, belonging to the Egyptians in 3000 BC because we already dated the sepulcher to 3000 BC and we are the authority and it has to be like that. They are not letting the evidence drive the conclusions. It's the exact opposite. They are letting their conclusions drive the evidence. It's the same problem with stratigraphy. Right? When people go to date stratigraphic layers, they find artifacts in a particular layer. They dig it up and then they go to a historian and they say, Mr. Historian, we found this Roman-looking cup, 20 feet below the ground in this particular layer. Where do you date this cup? And then the historian, who only reads books and believes in the consensus, will then come back and have a date. He will say something to the effect of, well, this, according to all of our books and consensus says that this cup was dated to 200 AD during whatever Roman Empire. And then what the archaeologists will now do is they will look at that layer and they will say that layer now belongs to 200 AD. Right? That is how they date layers. There's no science in there at all. It's just supposition driving the conclusion of the evidence. Nobody is letting the evidence drive the conclusion. And that is where mainstream archaeology is failing. That is where mainstream history is absolutely dying. But here's the problem. Right? This is the stuff being taught as fact, though, even though there is nothing backing it up. When we look at all of those structures over there in ancient Egypt, right now the vast majority of people believe those structures are thousands upon thousands of years old. And the only reason why is because consensus and authority told them that is the correct date. That's it. There's no other reason to believe it. They don't have any evidence for it. There's no way of dating, rock. You can't do that right now. There's no way of knowing when a particular block was carved. It's impossible. We do not have that method, right? There's no accurate method to do that. So where are they getting these dates? Well, of course, then you can say, well, they got them from hieroglyphics and all of that stuff. There's no dates on any of these hieroglyphics. There's nothing. We have no dating methodology from ancient Egypt that lines up with the Julian calendar. Or I should say nowadays, the AD BC situation that we currently employ. There is no such thing. For the religious of you out there, it gets even crazier, by the way, because Egypt is in the Bible, right? And of course, mainstream history, mainstream chronology is based on the Bible. So they were trying to figure out where they could place, that whole Exodus situation and all that crap. And of course, they're now dating biblical events using garbage history. So even religious people are being misled on this whole topic as well. Right? There's no reason to believe any of these dates. Egypt gets even crazier when we actually look at the real evidence. And this is actually going to be very important for the zero event thesis, because what we have discovered and what we are finding, Egypt is not 5,000 years old. Those pyramids have not been sitting there that long. It's funny, actually, we actually know this as well because we can test erosion patterns. So a lot of their buildings over there are made of limestone. We've actually done a lot of experimentation to see how long limestone survives in different weather categories. When you look at the weathering patterns that would have been created by the sands over there in northern, in the Egyptian desert type of area, there's no way those buildings would have remained in the condition they are right now relative to the sandy conditions that they exist in. It's not possible. It just wouldn't have happened. So when we start to look at the scientific evidence, when we start to look at the geological evidence, and of course the geological evidence gets interesting, especially on the alternative side of things, because of course there's the whole water erosion situation in the Sphinx enclosure that was discovered. And of course that has now thrown the Sphinx back like 10,000 years or whatever magic date they're choosing nowadays. And the reason they've done that is because they believe they're doing honest geology, right? And they're coming from a good place, but it's funny. Nobody is listening to any of the history. There are other reasons why those kinds of erosion patterns could have happened. And in fact, our ancestors tell us. It's right there. It's not hidden. Right? You don't need to send the Sphinx back 10,000 years. Alternative researchers are committing the exact same crimes that historians and geologists and astronomers are doing. When they don't really have an answer, they just say, it's probably like a million years ago. Yeah, a million years ago. Because now they don't have to prove anything. Right? Now it's ambiguous enough to where it sounds legit, and there is some scientific evidence that will support the legitimacy of that claim. And then people will run with it because there's no way to really disprove it. Except, in this case, there is. Because there's a ton of other evidence that everybody is ignoring. And some of that we just went over in this show. There's no reason to believe that any of these structures are that old. In fact, it appears to be the opposite. It appears that basically all of those structures in the Egyptian area and under the water. Remember, there's whole sunken Egyptian cities as well. All scientific evidence, all historical evidence, when you put it together, really does show that those structures are not that old. It's entirely possible that the pyramids, for example, are no older than maybe 2,000 years. Maybe. It could be a little earlier. That's entirely possible. If that sounds crazy, ask yourself why. Because everything that I have just said is scientifically possible. The reason why a potentially younger Egypt is crazy to people is simply because the consensus that they have chosen to agree with disagrees with it. And of course, as we just went over, all these consensuses are scientifically wrong. They're just wrong. They're historically wrong, and they're scientifically wrong. This is literally a religion. Believing that Egypt is 5,000 or 10,000 years old, or now there's even groups that think it's like 100,000 or millions or whatever the hell's going on now. That is all that's basically religious doctrine. Right? There's no reason to believe any of that. Now, if you want to try and flip the tables and say that I'm doing the exact same thing, remember, I'm not. I'm simply trying to find the objective historical evidence and the objective scientifically tested evidence and drawing conclusions from there. Now, obviously, we don't have all the evidence as shown earlier in this show, and that's a problem. So we can't really make the claims. It's hard to make any claim in a lot of cases. Like, I'm not claiming to know when Egypt flourished. I don't have any dates for you. We can probably come to some maybe basic dates. Well, let's do that, right? Okay, so check this out. One of the things that Fomenko and his teams discovered, was that all of the horoscopes that have been discovered in Egypt, right? All of the hieroglyphs that portray a horoscope, all of the dates for all of these horoscopes take place between 1100 AD and 1700 AD. Now, that sounds crazy, right? You think, wait, what the hell's going on here? Wait, what do you mean? So what that means is that whoever was doing the hieroglyphics, which I do not believe it was the people who built the pyramids or any of those megalithic structures, right? I believe I went over that earlier. Whoever did the pictographs They did not build the pyramids. That was not happening. There's nobody was doing that, right? Whoever did the hieroglyphics, they came way later. And the evidence is literally right there. They recorded the dates that they lived in. Whoever did these hieroglyphics lived during a time between 1100 AD and 1700 AD. I get that also sounds insane, but look at it from a realistic point of view. Think about this, actually. What was going on in Egypt during medieval times? Or the early Middle Ages? What was happening during those times? Who lived there? What was going on? Right? That era in history gets weird because it interestingly enough, it becomes a rather gray area with the mainstream, because then the mainstream has to try to explain what all of these great Egyptian people were doing for like 1,000 years while accomplishing nothing. So it gets a little weird, especially with current culture problems that we have, and I'm not going to get into that. But we actually do have an answer. If we just pay attention to what's there, the evidence right in front of us, we now know. Right? There were people living amongst the ruins of whatever culture existed before the Zero event, and those people created the pictograms that we see, the hieroglyphics that we see. They obviously were, they were still working the stone here and there. They weren't great at it. Right? We know for a fact that the people who come later are operating at a lower technological level for whatever reason. Well, I say for whatever reason, but we know the reason. Cataclysms had literally set people back all over the world multiple times. Whoever was living in the Egyptian ruins, they would have been the survivors of the Zero event. And I don't know who those people were. Don't ask me. That's a whole other topic. But they left evidence of their dates. They literally left horoscopes that date their own civilization. And it's all over the walls. It's carved everywhere. There's tons of artifacts for it. They're right in front of us. And it's very clear, right? There was the hieroglyphic civilization anyways. That was the Middle Ages for Egypt. And they lived amongst the ruins of the civilization that existed before. It's that simple. And it's all right there. Hell, they even describe it in their hieroglyphics. It's insane. Okay, anyway, I'm getting off track. So that's the problem with Egyptology and chronology. Right? We have no reason to believe the mainstream chronology because the mainstream has no evidence for any of their claims. Even the claims that they make, they can't agree on. Right? This is never discussed anywhere. Nobody brings up the problems of the King's List. Because if they do, everything has to change. And that is quite literally everything. Because don't forget, right, other chronologies are based off of the Egyptian chronology. So if you have to throw out the Egyptian chronology, you have to throw out everybody else's. But the good news here is that if we do this, suddenly history starts to make a lot more sense. Yes, everything changes. It does. Quite literally everything changes. I know it's kind of a meme to say, you've been lied to about everything, but you have been. We have been. You and me. Everybody. Right? We have been swallowing lies this whole time. And now look where it's gotten us. I mean, look around. Mainstream history is in such a ridiculous state right now that you can't do anything with it anymore. You can't question it. You're not allowed to bring any new evidence into it, and any evidence that you do bring into it that might change it has to be dated differently, as we saw earlier in the Fomenko part. Then you will find a lot of different things that maybe didn't make sense originally, now make complete sense. And that's generally what we find once we throw away the mainstream chronology. So I'll leave it at that.